Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's session uh, for the CR's Corporate Governance Digital Symposium. Today's topic is board diversity, the next lap. Before we just go on into the session, I'd like just to make a few comments and announcements. So attendees, you're allowed to ask questions, so you don't need to wait till the end of the presentation or during the Q&A session. You can actually just jump in to ask your questions in the Q&A box. So if below at the bottom of your screen, you will find there's a Q&A box. So please type in there anytime you feel that an urge or a comment that you feel that any one of our panelists have made that you really want to feel and share your viewers as well, please go ahead to do so. So let me just introduce our speakers for today. With the current COVID-19 pandemic, do boards have the relevant skill sets to chart the company through this crisis? When and why diversity improves a board's performance? What are the factors required for the board to succeed? These are some questions that will be pondered by our speaker and our panel this afternoon. Without further ado, let me welcome our speaker, Dr. Roger Barker, who is the Director of Policy and Corporate Governance, Institute of Directors in the UK. Good morning, Roger. Welcome.
Good morning, Richard. Thank you very much.
It's been a while. Sorry we couldn't receive you last year, but we couldn't have you again physically here, but we have you virtually in person.
Thank you. I think the next time I come to Singapore, I will really appreciate it because it will have been such a long time. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Roger. Could you please, we'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you to David Gerald and the entire CIAS team for this invitation. I'm really delighted to be here. Let me now just share with you my presentation, which hopefully is coming up on your screen. And today I'm very happy to be discussing this issue of board diversity, the crucial issue of board diversity. I think, in the space of probably 10 years, the diversity of the board as a corporate governance issue has gone from something which is very niche to one that is viewed as of paramount concern in corporate governance. The benefits of corporate diversity have been reiterated on many occasions, and I think we should by now, I think, all know what they are. But here at least are the results of a recent IOD survey, which was conducted last year, and hopefully I can just turn the slides. And this is really, I suppose, the essence of what directors, UK directors, see as the board diversity value proposition. It's seen as driving transformation in the overall corporate culture, in improving the quality of decision making, not least by acting as a counter to that endemic issue of groupthink, and also enhancing the ability of the board to innovate and to manage risk. And I think these performance enhancing aspects of diversity have really been taken to heart by many boards in many countries. And I think it's really a reflection of how our societies are developing as well. If companies are going to be accepted and, more importantly, trusted by the societies in which they operate, they need to reflect changing societal expectations, and they need to reflect the changing composition of societies themselves. And this reflects the view which I hold very strongly, which is that the company is part of society. It doesn't now sit above or aside from the rest of society. It must evolve with society, particularly at the level of governance and leadership. I guess the first lap in terms of board diversity development has been in relation to gender diversity. There's still much work to be done, absolutely. But we should acknowledge that in many countries, there has been some real progress over the last decade. And this slide, this chart, provides, I think, a very encouraging representation of how all male boards have now all but disappeared from major UK companies, certainly the largest UK listed companies. And that's really happened, as you can see, over the space of less than a decade. In the UK's case, this wasn't driven by legally mandatory gender quotas, as it was in many other European countries. Rather, the push to diversity, it really emerged as a movement in the wake of the financial crisis in 2008. And key roles in pushing this issue forward were played by the UK business community itself, through bodies like the 30% Club, for example, also by institutional investors more recently. And also, it has to be said, although we didn't have quotas in the UK, there was some firm prodding in the right direction by the UK government, which sets some non-binding, but nonetheless pretty compelling targets for business, which I'm glad to say they've now achieved. And in the FTSE 350 largest UK listed companies, we're now at 32% female representation on boards, and that compares with only 9.5% in 2010. So that, I think we have to in a guarded and non-complacent way pat ourselves on the back for that. There's been a similar sort of development in the United States as well. I mean, in the S&P 500, for example, all male boards disappeared last year in 2019, and in that same year, almost half of all board appointees in the S&P 500 were women. However, if we now take really, I suppose, a much more comprehensive global view, you can see that the global picture is in terms of female representation on boards is still very uneven. And this diagram here collates together quite a wide universe of more than 8,000 global listed companies collated by Deloitte. And you can see there's some of the variation here, and the vanguard position has always been taken by Norway, and that's still the case. And Norway, of course, introduced strictly binding gender quotas as far back as 2008. And other countries have followed that approach. Some other European countries have followed the approach of adopting a gender quota. I do have to note, though, when thinking about this part of the world, Southeast Asia, that Malaysian companies appear to be doing pretty well in this league table, setting a good example. However, the data also suggests, of course, that some countries have yet really to begin the journey towards board gender diversity, whether that's for cultural or historical reasons, or the extent to which their domestic markets have been exposed to global social and economic trends. That will vary, I think, in every case, but there's still a long way to go in a number of countries, as you can see. But even though when you look at Norway, which has taken such a leadership position in this area, that there remain some fundamental paradoxes which remain when it comes to gender diversity. So Norway, they have this 40% binding gender quota on listed company boards. They have a female prime minister. They have female leaders of all the main political parties. They have some of the most progressive childcare policies of any country in the world. And yet, only 7% of listed companies in Norway are led by a female CEO, which is a real paradox, I think. And I mean, some have suggested that the Norwegian efforts to increase female participation on boards may have actually pushed too many of, shall we say, the high achieving women in Norwegian society onto a non-executive track, rather to the detriment of achieving progress in the executive sphere. I don't know whether that argument really holds water. what I do know is that this pattern of underrepresentation of women in the C-suite, in the senior management level, is observed in many other countries. In fact, most other countries, including my own country and the United States, which suggests to me that the causes of that are more universal. And the fact that a country like Norway, which is such a progressive country in many respects, is facing this problem, it suggests to me that this is not an easy problem to solve. And even policymakers in Norway have rejected, for example, the application of a gender quota approach to the executive level. So it's this is a difficult issue to address, but it's one that I think we're going to have to grapple with if we're going to move to the next lap in board diversity, not least, of course, because the executive pipeline is a key source of future board members. And this slide here, it just reiterates my point, just in respect of female CEOs in the Fortune 500 in the United States. I think if we're also thinking about the next lap of board gender diversity, we are now, I think, starting across many countries to turn to other organizations beyond listed companies to look at how are they being led and how are they being governed. And if we look, for example, at privately held companies which are not listed on the stock market, particularly those in the fastest growing technology and venture capital backed sectors, as you can see from this diagram, the continuing lack of board gender diversity is even more striking than it is at the executive level in sort of large listed companies. And if you go beyond that to organizations like law firms, like accounting firms, consulting companies, institutional investors, there is still this real mismatch on an almost global basis between levels of gender diversity at the start of careers, i.e. when people are leaving university, where there does appear to be, in many cases, to be a good deal of diversity, versus those at the culmination of careers. So at the partner level, at the governing body level, this is still, I think, really a concern for many of these companies. And perhaps these type of enterprises have benefited from less transparency, less public accountability, and less policy attention than listed companies, which have really been in the spotlight in recent years. And I think there are going to be increasing societal pressures to change this going forward, given the influence and the significance of these service companies, these support companies in our modern business system. I think now, if we're talking about the next lap in board diversity, there is something of a slight shift going on in many countries from a primary focus on gender diversity at board level to encompass the equally important issue of racial or ethnic diversity. And just this month, the Confederation of British Industry launched a big campaign in the UK. It's called the Change the Race Ratio campaign. And it urges UK companies to sign up to a commitment of achieving at least one ethnically diverse board member by the end of 2021. And to see what sort of a challenge that is, currently there are 37% of companies in the FTSE 100 which lack such an ethnically diverse board member entirely. In the next layer of companies in the UK, the FTSE 250, 2/3 of companies lack an ethnically diverse board member. And something else that the campaign is encouraging is the publication of ethnicity pay gap data relating to the entire organization. And this matches actually the legal requirement, which has been in place in the UK since 2017, to publish gender pay gap data. But I do think that ethnic diversity, ethnic board diversity, is an aspect of board diversity where companies are still at a very early stage in many Western countries. We haven't had really this period of progress which we've had in terms of gender diversity. And this lack of progress, of course, stands in contrast to the rapidly changing ethnic makeup of European and American society. And so we have a situation, for example, in the United States, where African American directors currently make up only 4% of board positions in the Russell 3000 companies. But there does appear to be a head of steam building up under this issue, not least in response to big societal campaigns like the Black Lives Matter campaign. In July of this year, ISS, the big proxy advisor, called on US companies to disclose the ethnicity of their directors and their senior executives. And also a very interesting development, I think, occurred in the UK a few months ago when Moody's, the credit rating agency, linked its credit rating of a major UK bank to the introduction of a bank-wide program promoting racial diversity. And it described this measure as credit positive due to its potential impact on reducing what it described as social risk. So that I think was a very interesting development, giving companies almost a clear financial incentive to promote more racial diversity. But when it comes to racial diversity, when it comes to ethnic diversity, I think that, this may be an aspect of diversity where some Asian societies have a great deal to teach Western economies, founded as many of them are on explicitly multiracial principles. And I was interested to see, for example, that one of Lee Kuan Yew's key points in his independence speech on the time of independence of the Republic of Singapore in 1965 was that, quote, everybody will have a place in Singapore. And perhaps the new mantra for corporate governance in the 2020s should be, everyone will have a place on the board of directors. Now, as we address the challenge of achieving more diverse boards and diversity actually across organizations more generally, I'd like to offer a few observations on what I think really needs to be thought through if diversity is to achieve its full potential and is to become a reality. And this really relates to the discussion which I think needs to go on boards and at the senior executive level in order to get to grips with diversity. First, I think there has to be a very honest and open recognition amongst all of us that some degree of bias is a kind of an endemic aspect of the human condition. I think it's a reality that people with similar characteristics, whether we're talking at the personality level, the professional level, the ethnic level, people with similar characteristics often may have a kind of inbuilt tendency to view each other more favorably. And I think this can be, you can see this manifested at board level in the way that it can be challenging for directors from more diverse backgrounds to really have their voice heard or to be seen as truly credible. And this can be, I think, quite isolating for people who are, so to speak, on the outskirts of the in-group networks. And it may reinforce the view of certain groups that they don't belong at the table. And this is something that we hear about a lot in the UK, where in particular non-executive directors from less conventional backgrounds talk about how difficult it is to get their points across to their fellow board members and get their points acknowledged by their fellow board members. And this is why, in some respects, just appointing a single person, either from a different gender or from a different ethnic background, it's probably not going to have a huge impact then on the culture of the board. And what we may find in terms of board dynamics is that existing board membership may either implicitly or unconsciously resist any change to their behavior. They may not want to adapt to new arrivals in the boardroom, even though on the face of it, they're wholeheartedly agreeing to and apparently embracing more board diversity. So I think that this is something we have to face up to. A second point I would make here is that those of us who sit on boards, those of us who are in leadership positions, should never underestimate the impact of our own attitudes and behavior on other people in the organization. Now, I guess one of the issues that you sometimes see is that when board members are thinking about promoting diversity, embracing diversity, the focus is outwards. It's to the rest of the organization. They're not actually thinking so much about themselves. It's what everyone else has to do. And that, I think, it misses the point that the board is incredibly important, and also, of course, the CEO, but the board as a whole is incredibly important for setting the tone for the entire corporate culture of the organization through its own behavior, through its own attitudes. So very important for the tone at the top to be supporting board diversity. And then a final point I just would make is that constructive friction is not necessarily a sign of an ineffective board. Now, sometimes, perhaps unconsciously, people are deterred from pursuing a more diverse board composition because they somehow think that this is going to make consensus more difficult, that people are going to disagree, and that this is maybe not something that should be encouraged too much. But of course, if you're going to really benefit from a diverse board, then I think as a board, you have to understand and embrace and welcome the fact that there are going to be differences of opinion and different perspectives on boards. And it's one, I think, should readjust how one views an effective board, not necessarily in terms of harmony and consensus at every turn, but actually a slightly uncomfortable board, which asks tough questions because of the diversity of the board composition, may actually be a better one. And finally, what I would like to do is just offer some suggestions about, I suppose, a kind of summary of some of the lessons learned from our diversity journey so far about what really makes a difference in achieving meaningful diversity change. I think all of those things there on the screen are very important. But I just want to make a final observation about the board appointments process. I think generally speaking, when boards are seeking to appoint new people to the boards, they obviously feel under a certain degree of pressure to make an in quotes good appointment, one which they won't be criticized for. And that can, of course, mean that the nomination committee and boards themselves there's a tendency to play it safe, to seek candidates who have existing similar experiences to those being sought or have been in a similar role or the same role. And this can lead, of course, to a very narrow recruitment brief. And the justification for that, of course, is that we need a candidate who's going to hit the ground running. But that, of course, then can be detrimental to diversity. It doesn't really offer the opportunity to bring on people who maybe need some development, who are not necessarily the finished article. And also another point I would make is that many organizations that in principle are open to diversity and want to encourage it may find that they're losing diverse candidates at various points in the recruitment process. And this part of this might be because diverse candidates offer diverse and unconventional answers to the interview questions and discussions which are had. And if you then just simply judge these answers by the norm, by standard benchmarks, then yeah, you may well view those candidates in an unfavorable light, which I think is very unfortunate. So there is as well as the candidates sort of adjusting themselves to the organization, I think there's also a need for us at the company level to have some flexibility in the way in which we're viewing diverse candidates. Well, that brings me to the end of my presentation. I think as you can see from my comments, achieving meaningful board diversity across a range of dimensions is not going to necessarily be an easy task, but the progress of the last 10 years in many countries in terms of gender diversity, I think has really shown that it is possible to make major strides in this area. And ultimately, I think we're all here today because we believe that overcoming this challenge is going to pay dividends in terms of value creation, and also, incredibly importantly, increasing societal trust in business. So I'm very much now looking forward to exploring these issues further with our eminent panel today. So what I will do now is I will just stop sharing my presentation. And what I would like to do now is introduce my panel. And what I'm going to do is introduce them one at a time and ask each of them to offer some initial observations on the topic, and then we'll move into general Q&A. I have some pre-prepared questions to ask the panel, but you of course can from the audience can put forward your own questions, which I'll be monitoring through the Q&A function. So I really do encourage you to do that as we go through this panel discussion. So to kick us off, I would like to introduce Dr. David Smith. Dr. David Smith is Head of Corporate Governance at Aberdeen Standard Investments Asia Limited, a very big and prominent institutional investor. And in his role, he supports Aberdeen's Asian equities and fixed income investment teams through research and engagement. And I should also mention that prior to 2011, David was with ISS, where he was head of Asia ex-Japan research. So David, very good to see you. And let me hand over to you for your initial observations.
Thanks, Roger. That was a great presentation. I think you touched on a lot of really interesting points there. I think I'll try and keep this brief so we all have a chance to discuss this on the panel. But obviously, diversity of all manners is important to us at Aberdeen Standard Investments. It's important to us both in terms of the way we run money ourselves. So we benefit from, or I benefit from working as part of a diverse team. And then it's also important to us in terms of the way we look at the companies that we own or are looking to own, because we believe that diverse teams with different factors of diversity, whether it's gender or skill set or experience or cognitive diversity, help boards make better decisions and reach better outcomes. And it's not necessarily around constructive tension and the willingness to speak up, but around having different perspectives on different problems. And when you bring different perspectives together, then that leads to better outcomes, we think. There's a few things you touched on that I think would be worth exploring as part of the panel. And one in particular is around mentorships. And we think that's something that's worked well in other markets, both in terms of internal mentorships within a firm, mentoring senior individuals of different backgrounds, different genders, to be ready to make a step into the boardroom, but also across the market as well. So what we've seen in Australia work pretty well is senior chairman, mentor, senior female executives, for example, in that market to be ready to step into the boardroom. And I think that's a really important step because there are some really outstanding senior female executives, certainly in Singapore, that we'd really love to see get into the boardroom and take part in those discussions. So it'd be really interesting to touch on the role of mentorships later on in the panel.
Thank you very much, David. And let me now turn to my second panelist, and that's Ms. Dian-Yi Lin, who is Senior Partner of McKinsey & Company and Managing Partner of McKinsey Singapore. where she helps government entities and companies design and implement major transformation and economic development programs. And I also know from her bio that she has been a lead author of McKinsey's recent research on gender parity in Asia Pacific. So why don't I now turn over to you, Dian Yi.
Thank you, Roger. Okay, I think sound's working. Thank you, Roger. Maybe just to kick off, to highlight 3 points. One, just to build on the business case, which you started to lay out. Some of the research that we've done shows correlation, and I will say correlation and not causation, that companies with what we call top quartile in gender diversity tend to outperform, and they tend to outperform by as much as 28% compared to the companies that don't have that same form of gender diversity. So I'm hoping that that's something valuable for David as you think about sort of the performance of companies. And I think it's important that we have some element to quantify this, because as you laid out, there are lots of sort of softer reasons, be it, you know, cultural, supporting innovation, etc. But we think that it is important that we can put a dollar number to diversity, because we think that helps the narrative and the business case, as you say, that while many are already aware of it, I think it's important we continue to reinforce it. That's the first. The second, you had started to lay out, which I thought was a very good list of what do we do about gender diversity, right? And I think that's something that is worthy of further exploration. Our research has shown many of the points that you raised are necessary, right? So leadership at the top, be it the chairman, the board members, the management committee, the CEO, have got to make this a priority, set targets, and make themselves accountable to delivering on diversity. That was, you know, something that our research has reinforced. Secondly, to create transparency, like you said, set targets, measure it, and report against it. In Singapore here, the SGX has done exactly that. It set a target for 30% of boards to be women by 2030. We're slowly inching towards that, depending as to whether you look at listed companies or all boards. We're probably somewhere between the 16, 20, 24% kind of range today. Right? So I think it's worthwhile exploring sort of, you know, what do we do? Accountability, transparency, and, you know, some of the measures that you had started to talk about on how exactly do we, when it comes to replacing or adding a board member, what exactly are some of the techniques that chairmen and nomination committees should take into account. That's the second thing that I think worthy of discovering. The third, I think, is worthwhile talking about women, and I think if we say gender diversity, let's talk about women themselves. David has talked a bit about mentorship. I think we need to perhaps shift the discussion to sponsorship, because, you know, you can very much kind of mentor lots and lots of people, but we know that for women to truly succeed, they need to have sponsorship, someone who's actually going to take risk on their part, right? And something that we should explore. And it also becomes incumbent on women to prepare themselves. You talked about the funnel, Roger, in your presentation. Too often we hear the excuse that the pool of women available with the right skills is too narrow. I think there is some truth to that. So how do we ensure that that pool is much broader? And that will naturally include how do we build the funnel through all levels of management in companies. So just a couple of thoughts to get us started. Look forward to the discussion, Roger.
Thank you very much, Dian Yi. Thank you very much. And let me now turn to my third panelist, and that is Ms. Yulin Goh. Ms. Goh is non-executive chairman of SATS Limited, a leading provider of food solutions and gateway services in Asia Pacific, and amongst a variety of other board positions, which are actually too numerous for me to mention. I'll just pick out what some of my personal highlights. She's Deputy Chairman and Senior Independent Director of Royal Dutch Shell PLC, a non-executive board member of DBS Group Holdings Limited, of Singapore Health Services Limited, and a trustee of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs Endowment Funds. So many board positions, and a warm welcome to you, Ms. Goh.
Roger, thank you very much. Let me first add my compliments, as my fellow panelists have said, about your presentation. It raises a lot of good points for us to follow through. I would also like to compliment that I'm seeing that there are 226 participants on the screen. And that means that there are a number of people well interested in this topic to spend their afternoon thinking about it and talking about it. And compliments to everybody who is giving time for this. I'll set the context for diversity. And this context has come into far more greater spotlight because of the pandemic. The pandemic has shown us that this is a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world, the VUCA. And in that context, the board needs the diversity of experiences, of insights, of perspectives, of aptitude, as the board deliberates on the risk rewards, on the opportunities and risk. And I would say that it's quite common for boards to think of diversity in the functional skill set. So have we got people who have got HR experience or accounting experience or sales experience, etc. But if all these board members visit the same golf club, go to the same restaurants, read the same books, then that's not diversity. So I think we've got to broaden that discussion of what diversity means. Now, the second thing, I see DNE nodding quite vigorously, as is David, is that we need to think of diversity as a business imperative. Not so much because it's socially right to do. Yes, it is, but actually it's a business imperative. And why is it a business imperative? Our institutional investors are saying to us, it's a good thing, it's a right thing, it's the right thing for an effective board, and we'll like you to do it. So I think it is worthy for us to listen to our biggest institutional investors, people like David from Aberdeen. Secondly, I think that if we think about it as a business imperative, then we've got to think about gender diversity. Half the world is made up of women. If we think about who makes some of the biggest buying decisions, 70% of decisions to buy cars in Japan made by the women of the house. So if we think of customer centricity and needing to understand our customers, gender diversity makes a lot of sense from a business imperative. Thirdly, I think if we think diversity, you can go every which way. And you could go crazy over all kinds of diversity. It's worthwhile to bring diversity back to what is the business about. If the business is about thrusts into certain markets that are important, then think about ethnic representation from those markets, because that gives the market insight. Shell, for instance, as an oil and gas sector, has a lot of considerations on government policies and how that plays out. So we have someone on the board who's got special skills and insights in understanding government policies. So I think understanding those kinds of diversity would also benefit what would make an effective board. So I'll leave it there, but I'd like to add just 2 points, David, for consideration. One, which many people have mentioned already, and I'd like to mention it again. The culture and the tone starts from the top. And if the board sets the culture and tone of diversity, it needs to permeate the entire organization. And that permeation is not just about diversity for diversity's sake. It is about diversity and inclusion. It's about how do we make the organization into a learning mindset for inclusion. So that's one. And two, it's a little bit of my pet hobby horse, so I've got to say it here. I think that matured boards need to think about how we seed the gene pool of experienced directors into the marketplace. And that means that if you're a matured, experienced board, we should think about taking someone who's not had experience on any boards. Great skill sets, perhaps, good insights, good functional skills, and just start to take one or two into the board, get them experience, and we are seeding the gene pool, the funnel, as the NE calls it. I'll stop there, Roger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yulin. Thank you very much for that. And let me now turn to my fourth speaker, who is Ms. Se Gek Chu. She is Audit and Assurance Partner and Center for Corporate Governance Leader at Deloitte Southeast Asia, and she has more than 25 years of experience in public accounting in Singapore, with a focus on serving multinationals and local companies in the real estate and hospitality industries. So can I turn to you now, Sarah?
Thank you, Roger. So Yulin mentioned about we have 226, but now I could see that we have increasing participant at 230. And it is also heartening to see that at this panel itself, we have more female than male as the panelists. And I think I welcome that approach by SIAS to really drive the diversity through the next lab. And when I look at what the fellow panelists, as well as Roger has mentioned, a lot has been focused on diversity and gender representations and all that. But I would like to just add on to mention that we also look at it from a different perspective. Three key domains that we are looking at: professional, meaning like Yulin have mentioned, when we look at skill sets that we need, what is the key trust that's pushing us through this crisis? Are we looking at, I mean, when I'm looking around, my neighbors have been doing a lot of ordering online. There's new home delivery right now. The modes of transportation and delivery has changed a lot. And have our SME models, have all our business model be changed? And are the board ready to embrace those change? And if this is the need that they require, do they have the expertise to guide them through this crisis? So this is where we are looking at professionals. And the next P that we look at is positional. Are they people who has the authority, that stature, that would be able to lead the board and the organization through the crisis? And then come the perspective, because each perspective will add diversity to the board and the decision itself, leading to better business outcome. And I would like to echo Yulin's point about inclusivity. And because we all know that diversity is an important priority for all leaders, and it is becoming increasingly evident that focusing on diversity without inclusion is not a winning strategy itself. And inclusion really refers to making all our members of an organization feel welcome and giving them equal opportunity to connect, grow, and belong, and to continue to be able to contribute positively to the organization, advance their skill sets and career, and also feel comfortable and confident and being their authentic self. And this is very critical, especially when we are working so much now offline and working remotely. How do we make people feel comfortable, be themselves? And I think the main difference between the two is that diversity is a state of being, and it itself is something that we cannot govern. But inclusion is a set of behavior and can be governed. So I would like to end potentially this few minutes of speech to say that, board should engage in conversation with management about improving diversity. And this in itself is an inclusive practice.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much indeed. And now that leads me to our final, last but absolutely not least, Mr. Shay Ganu, who is Managing Director and Global Practice Leader in Executive Compensation, Governance, Talent and Rewards at Willis Towers Watson. And he leads a team of over 500 consultants across 40 countries and has extensive experience of working closely with boards and management teams at some of the largest companies of the world. So Shay, over to you.
Thank you very much, Roger, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening from whichever part of the world people are dialing in. That's the advantage of virtual webinars. You don't have to be geographically constrained. First of all, congratulations to CS for putting this up as a topic. The fact that, as other panelists have mentioned, there is so much interest is very heartening. Second, it's also heartening to see a balanced panel. I would argue that Roger's role is like that of a non-executive chair, or rather a non-independent chair. So we have 3 and 3 on the panel. So well done there. So first of all, in my opening remarks, I wanted to focus on one of the advantages of going last is all the good points and all the important points made by everybody else. So I can just nod vigorously and say, yes, I agree. But I wanted to focus on a slightly different element, which is that of cognitive diversity. And when I saw the theme of today's discussion being the next lap, to me, that next lap very much screamed cognitive diversity, because yes, we've done a lot of work on gender diversity, and don't get me wrong, we still have long ways to go. And I'll share some stats with you in a couple of minutes. But thinking about cognitive diversity, that's about the board having appropriate level of independence and diversity to make decisions that are in the best interests of all stakeholders. And again, keyword here being all stakeholders. This pandemic has taught us, it's heightened the importance of effective leadership in tackling challenges, in creating innovative solutions, and steering companies through uncharted, unprecedented territories. And Singapore, bringing it closer to home, SGX and Singapore Code of Corporate Governance, the 2018 revision, Principle 2 of the code actually specifically calls out and urges listed companies to have an appropriate level of independence and diversity of thought and background in its composition to enable it to make decisions in best interests of the company. So the code for the first time called out gender and age, but as we know that diversity attributes are actually broader than gender and age. So to give you a little perspective, last month, Willis Towers Watson, we actually launched what we call the Board Diversity Index, a Singapore Board Diversity Index. We analyzed all 700 primary listed companies on the SGX, and we analyzed them against 8 attributes of diversity: gender, age, tenure on the board, because again, having directors with different tenure is important for cognitive diversity, board independence, cultural ethnicity, geographic experience, domain expertise, and industry knowledge. So 8 different factors, all of them coming with a view of what skill sets, experiences, ways of thinking, cognitive abilities that you need on the board. And short answer, looking at all this, and this may surprise some people, but what's the fun of a panel if it's not controversial? Short answer is Singapore boards are not diverse enough. Yes, the large caps and some of the larger REITs are actually exemplify board diversity. So the top 100 full marks, but the mid caps and small caps, there's just a lot of room for improvement. I'll just share a couple of thoughts, or a couple of stats. Nearly half of all SGX listed companies do not have a single woman on their board. Only 11% of all board seats are held by women. Within the top 100, the situation is better, which we have 16% of board seats held by women, but it's still nowhere close to the parity that we want, 50-50. Currently, a third of all directors are between the ages of 60 to 70. Less than 5% of directors are below the age of 40. And I completely agree with Ms. Go's point about seeding the gene pool. I've been a net recipient and beneficiary of somebody taking a chance and allowing me to sit on the board as well, having not had prior board experience. So below that age of 40 also gives you that age diversity perspective. And then when you look at industries or domain expertise, most of our directors tend to have experience in legal, accounting, or commercial backgrounds. And again, it talks very much to a theme that boards and companies want, which is defensibility and conformance and compliance. But good boards, and fully agree with the earlier comment that the business case for diversity is irrefutable. And again, we are not looking at causality, just correlations, but having multiple domain expertise represented on the board actually sees much higher sort of business impact, including PE multiples. So the investors also rate those companies higher. I'll talk more about that later. But sort of one key area that we found is we need other domain expertise represented on the boards, and we need other industries represented on the boards as well. Most common industries currently are financial services, industrials, and professional services. But if you think about how industries are all intermingling and ecosystem partnerships forming, you do need more industry and domain expertise. And finally, because this is again something that I find a subject that we definitely need to pay attention on, is independence. Currently, only 40% of companies have majority independent boards. Think about that. Even in SGX, only 40% of companies have majority independent boards. Nearly half of all the board seats are non-independent directors. And especially with the 9-year rule sort of kicking in from 2022 onwards, this is a golden opportunity for companies to start thinking about different ways of their composition. And I'll end with this, Roger, is I fully agree with the earlier sentiment about diversity cannot be spoken about without talking about inclusion. And all the research that we've done, all the consulting work that we do in this area, that diversity is important, but not just for the sake of diversity, but because a cognitively diverse board inherently will bring different experiences, viewpoints, reasoning abilities to the board's deliberations. And this implies that the boards also need to be inclusive and need to respect the different perspectives that directors have to offer. The contention of ideas, if you think about it in a diverse group, must be constructive to promote wide-ranging discussions, which invariably will lead to better decisions and a better business performance. So I'll end with that, but thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Shay. Well, thank you very much for that. And I think that's really got us off now to a very good start, having heard from all of our panelists. And so I've got here now a number of questions which I think are going to enable us to drill down into some of these issues. And once again, I do encourage the audience, submit your questions through the Q&A. I'm going to direct my first question to Dian Yi. And please, when Dian Yi is speaking or after she's spoken, please feel free, other panelists, to come in if you want to address this question. There's been some sort of mixed assessment so far about how well board diversity is going, I suppose, specifically in Singapore and in Southeast Asia. And Shay obviously, had some remarks about that, didn't he, in his comments? And there was that table which I put up with the Deloitte data going across the world on board gender diversity. I guess Singapore was somewhere in the middle of that. What's your take, Dian Yi, on the current outlook and state of board diversity?
I won't repeat the statistics that Shay has put out, right? I think they speak for themselves. I think there are two ways we can look at this. We can either look at it as glass half full or half empty, right? The positive is that the numbers that Shay quoted are actually trending better. So if you look sort of, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, right? The statistics were actually much, much worse. So from a trajectory perspective, we're moving in the right direction. Now, if you're a pessimist, you'll say, well, we moved, however, from 16.2%, if I remember correctly, Shay, right? 16.2% is the share of women on the SGX 100, right? That is an increase, by the way, of all of 1 percentage point from the previous 2 years, right? So I think mixed is probably a apt description of how we're doing, right? It's moving, but it's moving at glacial speed, right? That would be my assessment. I think Eileen raised a very good point around COVID. There is a real fear that in times of crisis, there's a tendency to retreat, right? We focus on resilience, we focus on protecting the bottom line. There's a tendency psychologically to kind of go back a little bit to what are we comfortable with, what do we know, retreating to things that we feel secure about, right? And the big fear is that the progress we've made on diversity, and I think it's right that Shay is saying, not just gender diversity, but broader definition of diversity, with the trends of COVID may either stall us or worse, set us back. Why is that? We know that in the COVID environment, there are certain groups that have been disproportionately affected. We know that whether we like it or not, women still bear the brunt of homeschooling, which I'm sure all of us loved tremendously, right? There's the brunt of care, which means that the number of women stepping out or having to take on additional burdens over the COVID period has been greater. That will have impact on the funnel. The other point is also that women are the ones tend to be in jobs that have been more displaced by technology or any forms of automation. And as we all know with COVID, as Geik Choo was starting to talk about, everybody's adopting technology more and more, right? And so with that, the probability, just because of the way that the distribution of jobs and gender, there's a high likelihood that more and more women will be displaced. I bring that up because we can all make sort of, ones and twos decisions when it comes to board changes or management changes in the sphere that we operate in. But from a funnel and a societal perspective, this can actually set us back quite a significant amount, right? So I think the term mixed is possibly, a fair, but underlies, at least in my view, a fear of going backwards.
Yes. Yulin, I wonder if you agree with that, because I mean, let me put a sort of a counter argument, which is that during the COVID crisis, boards are having to reassess themselves, are we actually structured in the right way to meet these new challenges? And there's certainly, we're observing in the UK more turnover on UK boards. Couldn't that actually be a source of opportunity for more diverse appointments?
So Roger, thank you for that. Actually, I think Shai and Geik Choo are about to jump in. So let me quickly answer and let them jump in. I hold a slightly different view, Yanni. Whilst I agree with you that there could be a proportion of women that will find themselves COVID and post-COVID being absorbed and having different duties to answer to. I also think and agree with you, Roger, that the pandemic is showing to the boards that they need to bring in new thinking, new skills, new understanding to the board. And this is particularly so because COVID has brought forward the disruptive agenda of the fintech world, of the tech world. And that tech world and its disruptive agenda is requiring the boards to say, okay, my world's changed and it's not going to change in 2 years' time, it's changing right now. And how do we bring the different new skills to it? So I think that's one. The second bit to this is that as we think about the composition of boards, I think Shai mentioned it, that the number of non-independents, and actually if you look at the boards, the number of long stayers is disproportionately high in many markets. Less so in the listed markets in the UK and Europe because of the governance rules there. Certainly quite high in the US and out in Asia. And I think the more the governance, the more people like David says and calls for raising the bar of effective boards, raising the bar of board composition and independence of board and independence of board thinking, it's going to drive boards to make the changes. And I think the turnover of the long stayers gives an opportunity for there to be change. The final thing I'll say, controversial, I confess I haven't practiced it myself. But in the UK and in EU, if there was a board change, generally the search firms are called for. And generally there's an independence of scouring the market, making sure that, all the appropriate names are on the table for consideration, including the diversity of names. Asia tends to be let's call who we know. You know, who am I familiar with? And I like this person because, you know, I've worked with this person. I think we need to get a little bit away from that and think about the broader landscape, and for boards to be a little bit more adventurous in bringing people whom they're not as familiar with, but you know what, might just bring in surprising insights that will help the board in their decision. So I'll rest there and let my fellow panelists get in.
Yes.
So maybe I'll jump in for a while here.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so I think we have talked so much about the pandemic. I just wanted to share one Chinese word is wei ji. In every pandemic, it is a wei ji. Wei means danger, ji means opportunity. So if we look at it both sides, there is a danger at this time that we may slow down on board diversity, given that board are so busy with, you know, like what Leanna has mentioned, looking at profitability, how to sustain the business. But at the same time, if we have enough foresight, we look at the opportunity that is coming up. Because with this opportunity, if you can seize the opportunity itself, then it is an opportunity for us to make that necessary change, to see what is the future. It's not just as looking at a short-term change, but the longer-term change on how we can better prepare our organization for the future. And it would create a good opportunity to relook at the board composition itself.
Yeah, thank you. And Shay, you wanted to come in here. Do you? I mean, have you any observations? Particularly, I'm interested in your practice, working with your clients, in terms of how just during this pandemic period, boards are actually changing, and if there are any new trends emerging.
Yeah, so thank you. And again, this is why I love panel discussions, because you learn through every discussion you learn. I'm learning. But I couldn't agree more with Ms. Go's comments, which I was chomping in the bits to actually share some of those. First of all, with the pandemic, I appreciate that in the workforce, yes, women are probably more disrupted, and women have this dual responsibility of care, not just for children but also for parents, particularly in an Asian context. So yes, there would be a disproportionate impact there. But generally, the pandemic work that we're doing with our clients, this more companies are actually looking at this as an opportunity to change the composition of the board, to do a board refresh, to do a board renewal. And it may not be the entire skill set, but I'll give you a couple of examples without mentioning names. The pandemic has made it very clear to people that boards were not prepared in a few areas. Boards were not prepared in crisis management. Boards were not prepared as much, and I'm making generalizations, of course, but boards were not prepared for human capital management. As in, COVID-19, first and foremost, is a human capital crisis. Its impact on the economy, its impact on jobs and businesses, put that secondary, but the fact or the way it incapacitated the world's workforce, that is going to be its biggest legacy. And so the human capital management, how do we get work done? How do we get work done differently? Working remotely, working offsite, using freelancers, treating everybody equitably, treating everybody fair. Just one small example here, because again, every time I share this, it makes my heart sing with joy. One of our clients in the US, actually during this COVID-19 crisis, they changed the CEO's compensation. And part of the bonus for the CEO this year is linked to rate of COVID-19 spread in the employee base versus rate of COVID-19 spread in the broader American population. Now, one could argue, given the social distancing measures or lack thereof, it's a soft target, but let's put that aside. But it did emphasize sort of boards and management team putting more emphasis on employee health and well-being. And sort of the third broad skill, which, and then I'll tie this all back together, Roger, to your question. Third broad skill, what we've also seen is in this pandemic, there has been an increase in actually cybersecurity attacks. All sorts of places where cybersecurity attacks happen all the time, but there have actually been spikes in some industries. And the boards are realizing that, with all due respect to having legal, commercial, accounting backgrounds, they need these other skills. And some of these skills have, in the past, at least in corporate careers, favored more women than they have men. Again, I'm making broad generalizations here. Some of the best sort of risk officers could be men or could be women. That's not the point. But the point is the boards are realizing that they need different skills. And as they look at board renewal, board refresh, why not fill those new skills with, if you have two equally qualified candidates, my vote would go for the female candidate.
Thank you. Now, I have a question here, which I think probably is initially well directed at David and Sarah, looking at it from an investor perspective and also a reporting perspective. And the question is, how should companies measure and disclose diversity? And do we need mandatory requirements for that, or are some kind of best practices enough? David, maybe I could ask you for that, address that to you first.
Yeah, it's a tough question. In terms of disclosure of diversity, I mean, obviously there are certain metrics that you can count, and there are certain metrics that you can discuss. And just to give some context as to what we look for, when we look at a board of directors as investors, we do our little board table, as you might imagine, on the companies we analyze, and then we discuss who's on the board from an independence perspective, and then we like to discuss what do they bring to the board. Do they bring perspective? Do they bring experience from an industry? Do they bring some kind of specific capability? Do they bring experience in another geography? Or do they just bring compliance with the listing rule? What we should be able to do is map the composition of the board to the challenges that the company is facing over the next 3, 5, 7 years. So I think Yulin mentioned this earlier, forgive me if it wasn't Yulin, but the excellent point is, if you look at where companies are now and then where they're going over the next, say, 3, 5, 7 years, we're seeing immense change in almost every single industry. And if you look at the major industries we've got in Singapore, banking, oil and gas, and real estate, and think of the tectonic shifts we're seeing in those markets, we need boards who are prepared for that change, and we need people who bring in different skill sets and different perspectives to the boards. So we look at the board and we discuss, what do these individuals bring to the board, and then as and when we meet the chairman, and we don't always get access to chairman, we get access to some chairman, we like to discuss how are you looking at a skills matrix for your board and your process for renewal. What kind of skill sets are you looking to bring onto the board, and how are you doing that, and what's your sequence for refreshment? So obviously you can't have a big bang change, but what skill sets are you looking to replace? And that's when you can have really good conversations with leaders of boards. Sometimes you get quixotic responses. We want someone who has strategy experience, capital markets experience, China experience, and it must be a woman. So tick every single box. As we say, bao san bao hai. One person must do everything. But this is where you can have this discussion. Now, when it comes to reporting of diversity, obviously it's easy for boards to report on metrics that are easy to measure. So, age, gender, for example, time on the board. But then there should be some kind of qualitative disclosure as to the background of the individuals and why they're on the board. And what we see from leading companies is a discussion, even if it's just a short discussion from an MC chair or maybe a chairman of the board, as to why the board is looking like this, what the skills are that the individuals bring to the board. And I think that's a real challenge, because we talked about diversity on the boards, particularly in Singapore, given this is where we are. It's not always apparent that boards are structured here for any reason other than independence. If you look at the skill set, I think it was Shai mentioned, you get lawyers and accountants and maybe someone from capital markets. It's not always clear that you're getting these different perspectives on a board. There are very few boards in Singapore where you can say, I know why that individual was recruited. I know why that individual was recruited. I know why that individual was recruited in terms of skill set. So some kind of qualitative discussion in an annual report on top of some of the quantitative metrics, I think is really useful for us as investors to understand why a board is structured in this way, and also the general direction of travel for that skill set.
Thank you. And Sarah, there's a real debate going on in the UK actually at the moment about how reporting and also the audit process should really start to extend beyond the kind of classic hinterland of financial reporting, and there should be much more coverage of disclosure of this type of issue. I mean, do you favour mandatory reporting standards in terms of different dimensions of diversity? How should we actually try to get a grip on disclosing this aspect of governance?
So I personally, I would think it's a bit akin to, in Singapore, where we are adopting sustainability reporting, whereby it's something new and we are starting to embrace it. And I would like organizations to actually move away from really ticking the box. When we actually had sustainability reporting, you would see that most organizations would just be ticking the box, reporting on the bare minimum requirement. and doing the bare minimum itself. But if a board is really truly believing in diversity and inclusivity, then like what David has mentioned, go beyond just the metrics itself, but looking at what are the qualitative factors that can be disclosed and communicated to stakeholders on how the board diversity and composition itself support the board strategy, for example. And also, then how do you incorporate that message in the board chapter, and also how it escalates down to the organization? I think that is more important than setting up rules and all that, but it's really the culture of the board itself that they want to effect that change, and they reflect it through their board charter and also their disclosure, and effectively communicate it to the various stakeholders.
Great, okay. Let me just, Shay was talking about cognitive diversity, which is interesting. Yulin, I wonder, do you think that these other dimensions, more traditional dimensions of diversity, such as gender diversity on the board or ethnic diversity on the board, does that in any sense feed into more cognitive diversity, or is cognitive diversity something different?
Thank you. I would actually like to hear a little bit more from Shai about cognitive diversity. I think the measure of diversity is about the effectiveness of board and board performance. Basically, that's what it is. Can we measure it? I don't know. I kind of agree with David. I think we have got to look at the whole, and the board itself, the NC, the nominating committee, needs to be able to reflect why this is the right board composition relative to its business and its business strategy and direction. So that's one. Does it link to and bring about cognitive diversity? I think it does come back to effectiveness of the board. What's the new thinking that we bring onto the board? Do every board director participate with equal voice, impact at board discussions? And how does the board bring about cognitive diversity, not just at the board discussion, but as a culture and as a tone throughout the organization? I think those linkages are important, but I'm not so sure how we can measure it. We can speak to it, but I'm not sure how we can measure it. But I think, and I'll share this, one of my boards recently did a little study, and we asked ourselves, and this is not just the tick box that boards do every year as to, board effectiveness. We asked ourselves, if we are a good board, which was what the survey was saying, where are we short to become great? Let's find out what we are not rather than what we are. And what's the gap and how do we close that gap? And I think this comes back to, now, how much can we say in the annual report? I'm not so sure. What we can say in conversations with people like David or institutional investors, we can say a lot more. But it does come back to the effectiveness of board. So I don't know, Roger, if I may, I'd like to hear what Shai says about cognitive diversity and whether that can be effectively recognized, reported, and reflected. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Shai, over to you.
Thank you. I'll just jump in and share some perspectives here. Again, so when we say cognitive diversity, there is an assumption that you're inherently making that physical attributes of diversity are a precondition for diversity of thought. And I appreciate that that is an assumption, right? That is a big assumption that we all make. But the premise behind cognitive diversity is that you have directors who have different experiences, different thoughts, different ways of thinking, different ways of problem solving, different ways of reasoning, and even contextualizing problems. Now, a lot of that, yes, you can't measure, but you're using the physical attributes of diversity as precondition. What you can measure, and we do this, so when we do board effectiveness assessments for our clients, we're not only just doing the questionnaire based, we're actually also assessing the composition and skills mix, but we're also assessing something very important, which we call stewardship styles. So every director has an aptitude on how he or she may approach problems, reason them, and come up with solutions. And if you think about this in sort of a HR lens, it's not too dissimilar from a psychometric assessment, where you're looking at every leader, every board member, what are the different attributes or what are the different stewardship styles that they exhibit on the board. And the premise behind this is not, again, singling out some directors or saying that some attributes are more important, some attributes are less. The main premise is, as a board, do we have all these behavioral and stewardship styles adequately represented? So that then we will get balance of perspectives. And to give you some sense, I mean, some of these expressions and phrases by themselves won't mean anything, but some of the factors that we look at are you a perfectionist? Are you procedural? Are you critical? Are you obliging? Are you autonomous? Are you expressive? Are you disruptive? Are you unpredictable? Are you daring? And putting all of these sort of and overlaying each director's profile can give you that stewardship styles diversity as well. And just maybe to round this off, one other point, annual report disclosures obviously can't get into this level of detail. But what, as an investor, just as a retail shareholder, what I would appreciate is the thought process that a board goes through when it appoints its directors. Why did we appoint certain directors? For example, in our last annual report, we stated that we want to expand to China. We have now appointed some directors who have experience working in China. And guess what? Not just experience working in China, they have experience working for Singapore companies in China. Hence, as an investor, sort of, I have that perspective that, okay, that's why this person is on the board. So completely agree with David's sentiment there. It's not just something that institutional investors should look at. It's something that retail shareholders should also look at.
Yeah.
Tianya, I wonder if you might want to come in here. I mean, is cognitive diversity something that you look at with your clients when you're assessing a board and you know, seeking to offer them advice?
Very, very much so, right? And that's why I was nodding vehemently as Shai was talking about, right? And I think, you know, for me, this comes back to the conversation we were having around inclusion, right? Because what is the purpose, the ultimate objective of bringing the multitude of styles, right? And Shai is talking about different proxies you can use to get the diversity of views. Ultimately, it's so that we're being open, we're being inclusive, we're taking into account things which may be blind spots to us as individuals, because we all have natural biases, and the ultimate goal is really one of inclusion, right? And, you know, on the belief that the more perspectives we have, the more open and inclusive we can be, the better the quality of our decision making, right? And so I think, you know, it comes back a little bit to this question of inclusion, right? And I just wanted to raise one thing. It's a little bit of a joke, but actually it's not much. We've done quite a lot of research about how, and you know, I'm taking women as an example of diversity, right? And we've done a lot of research on how women are treated, right? And what our research has shown is that the average woman on a given day faces 2 to 3 times more microaggressions than the average male person, right? Now, Shai is smiling because it's relatively well-known research. And the reason I bring this up is microaggressions are the antithesis of inclusion, right? It's the opposite of not being included, right? And we are, by the way, we live in society with a ton of these every day, right? And I don't know if Eileen or Gator will agree with me here. By the way, most men at this point look at me a little bit kind of puzzled and say, what does that mean? What does a microaggression mean, right? It is a way you are treated, you are spoken to, etc., in such a manner that undermines you in some way, right? And I'll give you a very real example, by the way, linked to this panel. I don't know if all of you noticed this. The organizers very kindly, in 48 hours ago, just gave us a couple of an admin brief before we all turned up to the panel today, how to use our Zoom, you know, what time to turn up, etc. And very kindly, they also included a dress code, right? And as a result of that, all of you are in shirts and ties, etc. Right? I don't know if Gekchu and Eileen noticed the same thing I noticed. All of the men were instructed to wear shirts because we're all going to be on a Zoom meeting. And the women were asked to, quote, look pretty, right? And that would be an example of a microaggression. Now, I'm raising this, by the way, our organizers were well-intentioned, they were giving us flexibility. That was their intention, right? Interestingly, I'm looking at Eileen and Gekchu whether they noticed it, because I'm pretty sure David, Roger, Shai, neither of you noticed it. And Eileen's nodding because we all noticed it. The three of us noticed it. We all received the same email, right? And the reason I'm bringing this up is there are certain biases in human society. We're all human, right? And the reason we're having this discussion, right, is how do we become a more inclusive, open society such that we can make better decisions with better information, with multiple points of view that aid decision making, right? Sorry for that long sort of soliloquy, right? But to bring us back to why are we doing this, right? Yes. Because otherwise, we'll have a nice discussion for 2 hours, but we don't, move the agenda forward.
Sorry, Roger, just to interrupt you for a second. Danny, can I just say thank you? Because I hadn't even noticed that. I read that email, but I hadn't even noticed it because you don't make that association. I'm very sorry, but thank you for raising that.
Yeah. So I don't know, Eileen, if you and Gekchu know.
Jenny, I was nodding vigorously because I did notice it. Because I would normally look at dress code, and I was a bit taken aback. And this is not about the organizers. I agree with you; they're well-meaning, but there's stereotyping in the world. But you know what? I think, Jenny, it's up to each one of us to make that difference. Whether it's at the boardroom and whether it's in everything that we say. I'll tell you this: I sit in a company. You can guess which one, where the large proportion of executives are male. And when we get a female who comes to present, it's a big company and a female is there presenting, the first thing I'll say is how wonderful to see a female come and present to us and give us your point of view. And it's just giving the female a little bit of confidence to say, we'd like to hear your view. And I think if the board sets the tone and bring it all the way down the organization, or someone like yourself, Danny, as you go out and talk to people, and you kind of try and work the opposite of the stereotyping, to bring it a little bit more to the fore. It's incumbent on all of us to make that difference.
Agreed.
Sorry, Roger, I jumped in.
Wholeheartedly agree. Sorry, no. Roger, we've taken you off your.
No, not at all. So I have to say, Dianye, I did notice that, and it's actually perhaps my presumption was slightly different, because I did notice it and I did think, but I thought, this is not the UK, this is not Europe. Maybe people think a bit differently about these things in other countries. That was what I thought. So there we go. That's just proved me wrong in a completely different way, hasn't it? So absolutely. And maybe, Sia, maybe I could just come to you. It's in a kind of related question, I suppose. And that is, how do you think that the diversity debate differs specifically in Singapore, perhaps from how it has been developing in other countries, maybe in Europe, maybe in the United States? Has it focused on different aspects of diversity? Or has just diverse than in Europe? Maybe as I alluded to in my presentation, maybe there's been more of a historic concern with racial and ethnic diversity, and gender diversity is something which is just emerging now. Could that be it, or has just simply diversity been less of an issue in general in this part of the world?
I don't think diversity is less of an issue anywhere. I think there is actually a lot to be done in diversity everywhere itself. And a lot has to do with also I think two main things. One would be the cultural difference that we are in. I mean, one clear example would be just what you have mentioned. To you, you mentioned it was perfectly, you think this is the norm in Southeast Asia or in Asia. But to us, we think that this is not the norm. So again, it is different cultural background, different upbringing that we have, that we think, you know, that maybe the path is greener somewhere else, they do better. But in fact, I think a lot has to be done to actually bring up that ratio. I mean, I was just looking at the ratio. If we continue like this with increase of 1% every year, potentially it will be my granddaughter times where I see that parity, and I would be gone by then already. And it takes so long for us to get there. And so I don't think it's really about any difference where we are. It is that the effort has to be continuous to make that conscious effort itself. And like what Yulin has mentioned, a lot of effort has to be made to highlight it. Without Dian mentioning it, I do acknowledge that there is a difference, but to me, I think that I find it is okay because we all look beautiful, we look pretty anyway, anyway. So to me, it's just, if you don't let me know what is the instruction, okay, I'll just do whatever I like, and I think we are all perfectly beautiful, perfectly pretty anyway itself.
Well, that's very reassuring. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think, but then again, it may give people a different thoughts itself. People may think differently. So we always need to give women the encouragement that we are all perfectly fine and we are doing a good job itself. And I think the second state that I like to say is potentially it could be that different country has different way of managing it. For example, certain country has legislated that you need to have a minimum like 30% on board of women on board. And that's why you see that the ratio or the quota, because of the quota and the ratios requirement, you see that necessary representation. But certain country, they don't. And you will see that maybe that is why, you know, the representation would be much lower. But is it really that? Do we really need to have a metric to measure that? Personally, I think that maybe for a start, we may need to, in order for us to improve on that ratio as a start. But then I would think that as you continue on, it should be the state of mind. People should change their mindset and believe that diversity actually leads to better performance, and it become intuitive that, you know, I'm looking for diverse board, and this should come into mind. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. And well, let me, David, I wonder if I could ask you a question. I mean, it's been noticeable to me that many institutional investors are now really taking a stand on this issue, along with other, you know, range of other, what come, I suppose, under the umbrella of ESG, you know, to use the rather crude parlance. But a number of institutional investors have actually stated policies, you know, that they're going to vote against the re-election of board members. They're going to vote down the approval of the annual report and accounts if, for example, if board diversity targets or minimum thresholds are not achieved. I mean, what's your take on the role of institutional investors in campaigning and engaging on this issue?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think voting down a report and accounts or against the chairman, for example, is certainly the report and accounts is an extreme action. But I think for many investors, we've got to the point now where the status quo is in some cases quite frustrating. So I think I pulled up the figures recently for some internal work we did, and I got Singapore on generally 16% of board seats are female. Malaysia, as was mentioned, was far out ahead, but you know, lots of Asia is sort of high single digits, low double digits in terms of gender diversity. And that's before we get into the other type of diversity that we've spoken about. So for investors, I think whilst COVID has accelerated a number of the challenges that's been mentioned, you know, we've seen these big shifts that I've been talking about for some time now. And the blending of industries, the use of technology, the way that your route to market is changing, the way your entire industry is evolving. And I think we've got to the point now as investors where you know, we really need boards to act, because having a board of 4 male accountants and lawyers, and you know, I have great respect for accountants and lawyers, but having boards structured like that is just not good enough on a number of levels. And so whilst investors don't like to vote against report and accounts or vote against chairman, I think we've reached the point now where we have to do it. Now, the other question I have, and actually I wanted to ask a question for the panel. Sorry, Roger, I'm taking your role here. But if I look at Singapore, where we're all based, I don't see a very narrow pipeline in terms of senior female executives in Singapore. We own a lot of companies in Singapore. We interact with a lot of companies in Singapore. And I see tremendous talent in senior executive ranks, the female. And obviously this is somewhere where Singapore leads. And I can think of certain industries where we see some really exceptional females. The question I have is, how can we get those senior executive females into the boardroom? Do we need more structured mentorships or sponsorships, as I think Yulin corrected me to say sponsorships, but I agree, that's kind of what I'm getting at. How can we do more to make this happen? Because there has to be a demand side, but there has to be maybe a structural change on the supply side as well. So that rather than as investors just whacking someone over the head and saying, appoint a more diverse board, we need to make sure that the supply is there as well, that we can point to structures to take advantage of. And we've seen this happen, as I mentioned, in Australia with mentorships, which are effectively sponsorships, Yulin, to your point, of senior chairmen mentoring senior female executives and then ensuring that runway into boardrooms. So I'll answer your question, Roger, and I think I have, but also a question for the panel as well, as to what kind of structural changes when I say we as a country, I've been here 15 years, so I slip into the we, but what structural changes can we as a country make to ensure that we have these diverse boards? Because this is not a nice to have for Singapore. This is a really important issue for the long-term success of our economy. So how can we do better to make sure that that supply is coming through?
Anyone want to answer that? Yulin.
David, really good point. Actually, it wasn't me who mentioned sponsorship. I think it might be DNE.
Oh,
but
sorry. Apologies.
Right, but absolutely right, David. So let me put it this way. Because I chair board myself, and I also have to think through the diversity, as well as the cognitive diversity, as Shai says. Shai probably will know we have a very open board that is not afraid to say things and constructively challenge. But back to gender and back to diversity. I think that firstly on female executives, you're absolutely right. I think the funnel is there. However, I think we have to be very cautious, and I advise this to my friends, that if you're in an executive role, you've got to be very cautious about how many board roles you take up because of time. And actually not just because of time, but because of timing. Yep. So you can imagine every CFO would be on a board list. But just as the board meets in order to be about to disclose its results, is when the CFO is required back in her executive role.
Yep.
So I think that the funnel is there, but actually for the time being, it's not as big as it would seem, simply because many of them will have to be a little bit more circumspect. But that's a good news, because as this senior cohort works its way through seniority, they will become available for boards over time. That's how I would put it. Then I'll look at it from the other angle. And it is something I think that has been looked at in Singapore. I actually do think that there are a lot of boards with some long stayers. Although we have some rules around it, but it is good for us to see turnover, to see some changes, and they will bring about independence of view. They will bring about fresh perspectives. So I think having some rules on not overstaying would be helpful. And I think those rules are coming. So again, I think that's the second positive. I think the third one is the most important. And the third one is, how do females get onto boards? And you know, there's a number of females who say, I'd like to get onto the board, but no one would invite me. And the boards would say, I need someone experienced. And so I'll circle back to, if you're a matured board, it would be helpful to just take on someone who is new to the board scene and seed the gene pool. So I think that's one. I absolutely agree about sponsorship. I think sponsorship is important. And I think that boards and board chairman in Singapore, and I'm one, so I'm just as guilty. We need to think about how we bring new board members on. The current way it's brought on is fairly much an old boys club. It's who I know, it's who I meet at a golf course, it's who I go and drink with, and it's who I'm comfortable with. And actually, it's precisely that we should say, those are not the people you should be looking for, because they are exactly the same stereotype as you. And that's the danger of groupthink. So, you know, some of us need to think about how we scour more broadly for our new board members and new board intake. And maybe that's something you could challenge your boards with. How do you bring on new members? Who are you looking for? And how broadly are you searching for them? So that's my answer.
Yes.
Thank
you. Diani,
Roger,
I just...
if you don't mind.
Yes. Oh, please do. Yes.
You don't mind? I'd love to jump in there, right? And I think, David, the first answer to your question is, we need more Yulins. We need 100 of her, right? Who are going to do exactly what she just described, right? By the way, in fairness, there are other board chairmen who are working very hard on the cause, right? But number one is we need more Yulins. Number two, we need more Davids, because the pressure needs to come from multiple angles, right? And there's nothing like, answering to institutional investors, right? The third is, I think there is something about just techniques, right? So one is a mindset, which Yulin described, but there are techniques, right? As you described, let us make our search for our next new board member objective, right? Let's make it based on a set of skills, cognitive skills that we believe will be additive to the board. Let us make it a requirement that the slate that comes up to the nomination committee must include a representation of society. That means balance between men and women. That means balance between a different set of profiles, right? Just reflect society, right? We don't need to go up above, right? Just reflect it. And I think it's requiring some of these kind of, techniques to just be used on a more regular basis. That is on the board side. I do think it is important that we also address, in this case, women, right? And I think it's true broader, but Yulin raised a very good point. We see this with many of our executives as well. Number one, the pool is not as big as perhaps it seems. It is very biased in some sectors, right? So, I think we do better in financial services. We don't do that well in real estate. We do terrible in logistics, and we can go on sector by sector, right? So it is a skewed view that you see today, but it is improving. So that's the first thing. The second is, we have a lot more women often in support roles rather than what we call P&L roles, right? So it's great and it's wonderful that you are part of a management committee if you run HR or legal or any of the corporate functions, right? But without having run a P&L or having the experience of running a P&L, you won't be taken seriously, right? So there is something about a skew. While we see a lot of women in senior positions, there is a skew towards more support functions than necessarily P&L functions, right? The third is, I think, to your point, Yulin, there is work that women need to do to put themselves out there and being prepared, right? Nobody wakes up one day and appears on a board, right? Yes, sometimes it requires someone to take a chance on you. Often it begins because you've had experience on a non-profit board or a smaller company board or a non-listed company, et cetera, right? And I think it does become incumbent on women to also, within the remit of not taking too much on, to also build their skill sets and experience so that that pool does exist and they are available, right? So it's a complex, it's not a single silver bullet, right? But it does require confluence of many things to come to happen.
Saya, I wonder if I could ask you, I mean, do you think here in Singapore, it would be appreciated if investors like David started really being more assertive, you know, in terms of, from a shareholder perspective, in terms of demanding more board diversity, more gender diversity? I mean, SIAS, for example, is an organization which, you know, works behind the scenes very much, doesn't it? And has been very successful in a very diplomatic way in trying to promote good governance. But in other markets, shareholders take a much more assertive, type, almost confrontational type perspective. Do you think that there's a more assertive approach would go down well on this issue in Singapore, or is it not the right environment for that?
I thought that question should be actually posted suitably more for David. He's the investor.
Well, yeah, I'll ask him afterwards. I'll get your perspective first.
Well, I think there is really, again, two thoughts to it. First is, really, do you want to drive diversity by really imposing quotas or imposing stress just purely because it's an requirement itself? And again, diversity for the sake of diversity itself doesn't mean anything, because we want diversity with inclusivity itself. So it would be sad if we go down that route and then it is diversity for the sake of diversity. Right. And then we will be moving like 10 steps back from where we are today. Okay. So I would rather like the investors could voice out. It will then let people go in and re-look at what is the skill sets that is required for the board. Let them re-evaluate what is the required skill sets and then reposition, recompose the board itself.
Yeah. Yeah. David, is that also your approach, or do you plan to sort of up your pressure in the coming year or so?
Yeah, I mean, I'll respond briefly because I covered that earlier. But yeah, I think you'll see more investors put pressure on boards in one way or another, and that pressure increasing, not just Aberdeen, but other boards as well. I think there was a question about quotas. I think we've seen quotas work in some markets, but really fail miserably in other markets. And we've had companies in some markets where we've said, who is this individual on the board and why was she only there for 6 months? And the answer has been, we don't know who she was. She was a friend of the COSEC, but we needed a female to hit the quota. And that's a God's honest answer we had from one company. So quotas are a fairly dangerous step, I think. And then I'll stop there because I think Shai wants to say something as well.
Yeah. I mean, if you have any more of those stories, I'd love to hear them, because that is indeed a god-awful story. But thank you, David. Maybe I just want to make a couple of points. But perhaps thinking about Singapore slightly different from sort of the other developed economies or markets. One key distinction here is we have a disproportionately large number of our listed companies that have a controlling shareholder, either be it sort of an institutional investor or it be family. Right. And it touches on both these themes about what Singapore is different to other markets, but also, David, your point about the funnel of capable women executives. The funnel of capable women executives very much is there at the top in the SGX, say 100. Below that, it's not as apparent again. And again, that's not a function of lack of capability. It's that these opportunities, probably the top 100 companies and the more progressive companies have been better at doing that. Like Ms. Go, like other panelists here who are champions for talent, irrespective of your gender. But I particularly was interested in your question that you posted to the panel, David, about what are some of the structural changes that you can think of. And Roger, I'm sorry if this was going to be your last question, but let me just share some thoughts here. So structural, and look, having been in the consulting advisory sort of business, every time there is regulatory change, there are unintended consequences. So things such as quotas, you're right, we've seen horror stories, but we've also seen some shining lights. Whatever happens, whichever way you look at it, quotas are important to shift the needle. India has a quota, it has high representation. Malaysia in the top 100, it has high representation. But my inherent issue with quotas is quotas should not be synonymous with tokenism, because that doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help investors, it doesn't help the company, it doesn't help the women who are on the board, right? Yeah. Because they are not treated with the same respect that they deserve as everybody else. So it is. So I am for some intervention, but not necessarily regulated quotas. So what I have to propose as a structural change, and this is something that all of us need to think about. My proposal for structural change is, rather than government or listing rules mandated quotas, what is a better way of doing this is if each listed company voluntarily discloses their own target. Our target is to get to 30% of women directors by 2025. Currently, we are 0. Other companies who currently have 25% women directors, they could say that our target is to get by 50% women directors by 2030. It is voluntary, it is not mandated, but then every year you disclose progress against those targets. The old adage, what gets measured gets done. I'll go a step further. What gets incentivized definitely gets measured and gets done. So it is also not uncommon to see, particularly in some of the Anglo-Saxon jurisdiction, some of these goals actually feature into the CEO scorecard. It may not be board diversity goals, but certainly management diversity goals feature into CEO scorecard. And increasingly this year, we're also seeing ethnic diversity feature into executive scorecards. You would have heard sort of in the UK, fairly large institutional investors, I'm sure Aberdeen and others, actually have now a policy or a thinking that if there is not at least one BAME, Black, Asian, Minority Ethnicity Director by end of 2021, then they would vote against that board. So I think voting from institutional investors is a very powerful tool that even Singapore companies need to be cognizant of. But that was one structural change. The second structural change, which is not easy, but there is precedent. And this may sound like an outlandish model, but I think we could learn from it. So in Indonesia, state-owned enterprises in Indonesia have a very peculiar arrangement for their boards, where first of all, it's a dual board of commissioners and board of directors, but the board of commissioners would be equivalent to a stewardship board, like our non-executive directors. So on the board of commissioners, there are two committees, the audit committee and the remuneration committee, on which these companies, particularly the state-owned enterprises, they have members on these committee who are specialists, but they do not serve as non-executive directors. So they're members of the committee, but not members of the board. And that can be a really interesting feeder pool or funnel, if you may, for inviting people to your board. So all of a sudden, instead of 12 board seats, you now have access to 18 board seats, 12 board plus additional committee members. You can use those committee seats to test capabilities, to test fit, because one thing that we've sort of also spoken about, but it's very important when you think about an effective board. An effective board is one that has diverse thoughts, it has dissonance, it has creative tension, but then it can also come together, be inclusive, and find a solution. If a diverse board is just at loggerheads with each other and just debating and arguing, that doesn't help either. Right. So the second structural change is probably to think about a construct that is broader than our typical board and think about feeder pools. We don't have to even go as far as Indonesia. In Singapore, our not-for-profit sector, we practice this. So in a lot of our charities and not-for-profits, you get directors who come on committees first before sort of you invite them to the full board. And then the third, which is goes back to the championship, goes back to the sponsorship. I inherently think more women should be encouraged to take P&L roles. For far too often, that has been used as an argument against women sort of going in senior roles, saying they have not managed P&Ls. Well, you haven't offered them. Push them towards P&L roles, sort of it's not even taking a chance. It's about, and it goes both ways. It goes to the company, but it also goes to women themselves putting their hands up. There is a lot of research, and we did a small experiment with one of our clients. This was a behavioral sort of economics type of project we were doing with them. With one of our clients, we built a job description. We built a job description that had 10 bullet points, and we knew that 4 of those 10, nobody in that team will achieve. And then we send that out and see how many people responded to that job descriptions. 4 out of 10 of those bullet points, bear in mind, nobody would have achieved, right? Nobody had those skills. If we send it to 50% men, 50% women, 80% of the men responded saying, yes, I'd like to apply for this. Only 30% of the women responded saying, I'd like to apply for this. Because the women said, oh, I don't meet 4 out of these 10 criteria, I'm not qualified. Men said, hang on a second, I meet 6 out of these 10, let's go for it. Right, so this is something that we also need to encourage our senior executives, women executives, to take a chance, and of course give them the support network that they won't fail.
Thank you, and I have actually got my final question here, which I still want to put, and I want to put this to you, Lena. I wonder if I could put this to you. This is a question which often intrigues me, and I think Shay, you touched on it a bit, and that is the question: is it possible for there to be too much diversity in some sense on a board?
That's an interesting question. I would put it another way. I would put it less about too much diversity and much more about too big a board or too many people in a room to have a really effective discussion. And I've been in boards where, 20 people, 20 executives are included in addition to the board. And you really cannot have an effective, open, thorough, constructive debate if there are too many people. So I would say in the first instance, it's the size of board that's important. Clearly, the more complex, you need to think about it, but take Shell. Shell, I think, has, I can't remember now, 11 or 12 board members. And we operate in 60, 70 countries. We are one of the 10 biggest in the FTSE, et cetera, Maybe not so now, maybe not in the top 10, but we were close. But you don't really need a huge size of boards. And I've seen boards in the UK, for instance, when in the UK at one time the trend was to put a lot of executive directors on the board. And that meant that they have to put a lot of non-executive directors on the board, and the board can go up to 16 people. Now, the Japanese companies are the same. It's just too big. However, now I come back to, so is there a dissonance if it is too diverse? Here is where I think the chairman plays a huge role. And I've served some really fabulous chairmen. I've learned from them all how they construct an agenda, how they make sure everyone has a voice, how they make sure that voices are respected, thought about, and followed through. And therefore, I think that it is less about too much diversity. It's much more about effective orchestration of the board and the board agenda.
Great.
I'll leave it there.
No, thank you very much. And we're moving towards the end of our session, but before we conclude, what I would like to do is to turn to each of our panelists for a final observation, a final takeaway that our audience can sort of go away with and try and perhaps implement or be inspired by. Of course, it's always tougher, isn't it, for the people I ask first, so have to think on their feet. And unfortunately, David, you're at the top of my screen. So David, your final observation, just in a minute or so.
Thanks. I mean, it's difficult to sum up what we've said for an hour and a half. I think one of the takeaways I have is that all we've done is nod our heads vigorously at each other for an hour and a half and agree with each other. we haven't had much difficulty agreeing. The takeaway I would leave is the same takeaway with companies, is this is not something to think about as being the right thing to do. This is not an extension of CSR or PR or call it what you will. This is a business imperative that feeds into your ability to sustainably create value over the long term. And people talk about sustainability, but sustainability of business models and value creation is what we're all about. And you need a diverse board with diverse skill sets and approaches to problem solving in order to continue to create value sustainably. So don't do it because you think it's the right thing to do. Do it because it's a good thing to do for your business.
Thank you very much, David. And Dian Yi, may I turn to you now?
Yes. So my biggest takeaway is actually one of optimism. I started pretty pessimistic at the beginning of this panel, but I leave incredibly optimistic for the following reasons. Number one is, coming out of this panel, I know that there will be ambassadors and voices who will repeat the business case and the narrative and the value of diversity. That's the first thing that I take away. Second is, I know we have Eileen, and I know there are more of her in many forms, and that for each person that is out there as well, they will make a change, because all we need is one or two changes in boards, and then we start to get a cascade, right? So I think it's the right chairmen who are making the right decisions, and I leave optimistic with that. Number three is, I leave optimistic because we are sitting on a diverse panel, at least gender diverse. I don't know if we are cognitively diverse because we are all nodding our heads at the same points, right? But at least we have a gender diverse group. And therefore, I know that there are practices in place today in Singapore that are actively being followed through. And if we perpetuate this, then we will all be in a better place. So I leave optimistic with those three takeaways.
Thank you, Dian Yi. And Saya, may I ask you for your takeaway for the audience?
I think I just have three takeaways. First of all, is I noticed that being nice itself is not enough. I mean, we all know what diversity is, and acknowledging that is really not enough. And inclusion is actually something very deliberate. We really need to make an effort in bringing our commitment to inclusivity. And lastly is, I think personal actions really sets the tone. It all starts from ourselves. And if, like what Dian has mentioned, one of us make an action, it will actually have a reciprocal effect itself. Yeah.
Thank you, Leah. And Shay, let me ask you for your final observation.
Brilliant. So first of all, thank you to all the panelists. This has been fascinating, and I share that sense of optimism, but I also share this sense of learning. We've got some very diverse perspectives here. Yes, we were nodding in the most part, but that's also a good sign for a board. Like, you're bringing diverse thoughts, but then you're coming towards one sort of true north. Maybe in the spirit of sort of summarizing three takeaways. Number one, certainly focus on inclusion. Can't stress that enough. You have, and Roger, this touches a little bit on your question. Could you have something like too much diversity in the board? Personally, that's sort of a second or third order question right now. Right now, for most people listening to this, get your diversity on the board first, then worry about whether it's too much or not. But rather, I would see this a slightly different way. It is possible, instead of thinking of, do you have too much diversity in the board? The question to ask is the board inclusive enough? Right, because you may have diverse thoughts, but if you're not channeling those, then sort of you're missing a trick here. And like Ms. Go, sort of the chairs that I work with, the chairs under whom I serve, I've learned a lot as well. And one of the things I've learned is really good chairs actually encourage cognitive dissonance. They would encourage a contrarian view. they would encourage a view sort of that is non-popular, and they eke that out from directors. So one of the committees that I chair, I actually make it a point that in every committee discussion, we discuss and at least one committee member expresses a devil's advocate view, a contrarian view. We document that, we minute that, because our hypothesis is it makes for richer discussion before you make a final decision. So that's takeaway one, which is focusing on inclusion. Takeaway two is I couldn't agree more with the comment that we need to start thinking about different gene pools, and sort of thinking about, and this is the onus on nominating committee chairs, this is the onus on board chairs to think about sourcing directors from different pools. I would go one step further. I would even say not just people who you play golf with. You perhaps don't even need directors who play golf. You perhaps need directors who play Xbox now, because that is more representative of your client base. So different gene pools, different talent pools, definitely. And number three, and I'll probably end with this, is diversity. First and foremost, companies have to realize that this is not just a nice to do. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have. And the business imperative is irrefutable. If anybody has questions about the business case, I'm very happy to, please reach out. Very happy to share statistics, our research. I'm sure there's McKinsey research on this as well. With Willis Towers Watson, we actually researched the top 100 SGX companies to show that correlation. Very happy to share that. But we need to start thinking about this as a business imperative, but also thinking of this that companies and boards have this transformative power and responsibility to contribute to an open, inclusive, and diverse society, open, inclusive, and diverse business community. And my contention, and I'll leave you with this, is a cognitively diverse board is the enabler for this to happen, because it sets the tone at the top and is the right place to start.
Thank you, Shay. And Yulin, the last word goes to you.
Well, Roger, thank you. I'm very tempted to just say I like to ditto everything that Shai has said. But let me just give you three thoughts top of my mind. The first is a quote from Marcel Proust, a 19th century French novelist. And I really like this quote. And it goes this way: the real voyage of discovery is not in seeking new places, but in seeing with new eyes. And this is what diversity is about as a business imperative. And if we make it a business imperative, then the urgency is different. So I think that's one. Two, in its business imperative, this is the theme is board diversity. I think that it's about diversity in the company, because in that very diversity is about inclusiveness. And in that inclusiveness is about a learning mindset of an organization. The need to shorten the cycle of learning, as we are seeing in this pandemic, is urgent. And the board needs to set that tone, not just at the highest level, but all the way down the organization. And that means exactly as Shai has said, we're going to ask for the alternative view, like it or not, and just make sure that we are seeing a problem solving from every angle. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is this, my third takeaway is I love this conversation. I've learned a lot. I have to say that, you know, I have a lot of respect. Thank you, Diane, for your shout out for me. There are many chairmen who are in exactly the same role of wanting to promote talent in the marketplace. And my urge to all women who are listening is to be less self-effacing and be more confident. Step up to the plate and believe that you can. And I say to all women that my first international board role was because I asked. I was walking out of a room, there was a search firm CEO, and I said, would you please put me on the list? I'm keen to have an international role. And he did. And I had my first step into it, and that was the breakthrough. So there's nothing wrong in stepping forward and asking. Be more confident. And many of us can have that role to help everyone be more confident. That's it. Thank you.
Yulin, thank you so much for that. And thank you to all my panelists. For me, this has been a tremendous panel. I think we covered a huge amount of ground in our time, and I found it incredibly interesting and inspiring as well. So thank you to CS. I hope you enjoyed watching this, and good luck with the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, members of this panel. One thing that we're thinking is that, you know, as this discussion on diversity goes on, we can actually take this debate much further. And one thought I have from CIAS is that, you know, we actually do the Q&A on annual reports, and we've actually covered over 500 companies already. And maybe one question is to ask the hard questions of diversity when they put up people for nomination elections onto the boards. So these are some of the further things that as CIAS we can do to further this discussion. I've learned a lot as well, and thank you, members of the panel, for joining us. With that, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Look forward to seeing you again soon, and have a great afternoon.